Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the final episode of the Fantasy Football Predictions and Breakdown for 2022. I'm your host, Ben Mosteller. Thank you for tuning into the Sports Lock podcast. We are doing the NFC West today. We have done the rest of the divisions in the NFL, and this is the last one. Next week, I'll be giving you my ranking sleepers and busts, so make sure to check that out as well as probably a mock draft. I'll let you know at each spot, each draft position, who you should be taking in each round, who you should be targeting there. So that'll all be coming up to you. Some very important fantasy football videos within the next 2 weeks before a lot of drafts go off. Some people might have drafted already. I normally wait till after the preseason to draft. So this is the time to pay attention to the preseason, see if anybody breaks out, and then the rankings again will be coming out next week along with the sleepers and busts. That is a podcast you won't want to miss. If you haven't seen the rest of my division breakdowns, go ahead to the Sports Lock podcast on YouTube or on Spotify and check them out. So let's get started with the NFC West here tonight. And we have the Arizona Cardinals first, and they finished second in the division for the first time since 2016, and they finished 11-6, which was their best record since 2015. The Cardinals are starting the season with injury concerns, though, all over the field, which they hope won't affect their whole season. That includes Kyla Murray, who's dealing with a wrist injury currently, but last year he finished quarterback 10 with 3,787 yards, 24 touchdowns, and 10 interceptions. He also added 423 rushing yards and 5 touchdowns. Both were fourth best out of the QBs. Murray did miss 3 games as well, to note to those stats. For passing, this was his second best year. For rushing, it was his worst. So I don't know if that was due to James Conner blowing up or if he was just passing the ball more, but that's a good sign to see out of quarterbacks, especially a running quarterback, that you know that they can throw the ball as well. They don't have to rely on the legs. Now, he will be without some wide receivers, and we'll talk about that here shortly. But currently, he's going as the quarterback 5, which might be a little too high for him. I think in my rankings right now, he's a little bit lower, like 7 or 8. But if he was healthy, he was on pace for being quarterback 5. So still a top 10 fantasy quarterback with top 5. I want to say top 5 upside. I was forgetting the words there. It's been a long day, but top 5 upside for Kyla Murray here. Definitely top 10, top 5 upside. Now, the running back's James Conner, and he shocked the fantasy world last year, finishing running back 5 with 752 yards and 15 touchdowns, which was tied second best behind Jonathan Taylor. He also added 37 receptions for 3 touchdowns. This season, he is the main back since Edmonds left for Miami, but there's always a concern with Conner for injury. As we saw in Pittsburgh, he had issues with that. And this was his most games played in a season at 15. Conner is not likely to reach 15 touchdowns. There should be a pretty big regression there in those numbers. And so I see him getting about maybe 12 combined touchdowns, which would have been around running back 13. And that's being generous. I think right now he's right outside of my top 15 in the rankings. But, I just see that he won't get that many touchdowns this year. I think 12 is kind of being generous. Right now he's going as the RB12, which is a little bit too high for my likings, but it's not bad considering he finished running back 5 last year. The downfall is that I think probably what we saw last season was his ceiling, which was RB5, which isn't a bad ceiling, but the floor is very, very low. You never know what you're going to get out of James Conner, and that's what's concerning, and you have to be cautious when drafting him this season. Now, the wide receivers, we have DeAndre Hopkins, Marquis Brown, AJ Green, and Rondell Moore. Arizona has a good wide receiver core, starting with Hopkins. He's going to miss 6 games due to suspension. Last year, he only played in 10 games, but was on pace to finish wide receiver 18. Marquis Brown, they get from the Baltimore Ravens. He was their number 1 wide receiver. He finished wide receiver 22 last year, 91 receptions, over 1,000 yards, and 6 touchdowns. AJ Green, wide receiver 40, 54 receptions, 848 yards, and 3 touchdowns. Rondell Moore, wide receiver 59, 54 receptions as well, but only 435 yards and 1 touchdown. So a lot of good wide receivers there. We'll take a look at the ADP, which is currently Marquis Brown, wide receiver 20, DeAndre Hopkins, wide receiver 41, Rondell Moore, wide receiver 67, and AJ Green, wide receiver 85. Right now, if you can find a replacement for DeAndre Hopkins, so 2 guys that you can really trust to get you to week 7, he's a good value right there at wide receiver 41, because we saw last year he missed about 7 games. He's about going to miss that much this year. He would have been wide receiver 18. So you're getting a guy at that value, wide receiver 41, that can win you leagues later in the season. I think Marquise Brown is a little too high for me. They're saying that he's going to do better this year, which he could. He's got a slightly better quarterback. But with all those wide receivers, unlike what Baltimore had, I think that he won't finish as high as he did last year. Rondell Moore might be a great way to end your draft. He has a lot of upside, especially with the injuries and the suspension at wide receiver. So I think earlier on, if you get Rondell Moore towards the end of the draft and you happen to get Hopkins, Hopkins can then take over. I think Rondell Moore has a good start to the fantasy season. Now, Zach Ertz is a tight end that I really like this year. Last year, he was traded midway into the season from Philadelphia. He finished tight end 5 with 74 receptions, 763 yards, and 5 touchdowns. And there's really not much saying that he's going to digress with his numbers. The receptions could be lower, in my opinion, from 74, but I think the touchdowns and yards are about accurate. Right now, he's going as a wide receiver 9, which is a steal, in my opinion, later in drafts because he's got top 5 upside. We saw it last year. Now he's had time in the offseason to work with Arizona since he only had half a season with them last year. And again, with the issues at wide receiver, I think he could be a great guy. This is a guy back in Philadelphia years ago that was one of the top tight ends he wanted to get in fantasy football. So I think he can get back to that. I think I have him somewhere around tight end 5 as well this season. So if you can get him within wide receiver 9, it's a great steal for you there. Now the defense, they're good, so they should have a pretty good season to help out this team. A pro is that they have a lot of good offensive options, a good defense. A con is that injury concerns to start the season that might hurt them. So we have to watch out for that early on. Maybe they're a team later in the season that makes a comeback. I don't know how that will affect them. But as of now, last year, they finished, as I said earlier, at the 11-6. I projected, and I'm going to pull it up here, which I always forget to prepare before I make the video. I projected that the Cardinals would go 9-8. So 2 games off there. However, this season, I think that they go 9-8. A little bit of a regression from last year. And I think that they will get to the 9-8 spot there. Very tough schedule. So again, with the injuries, 9-8 is where I'm comfortable putting them. Let's talk about the Super Bowl champs, the LA Rams. They won, of course, the Super Bowl last year, finishing 12-5 on the season. And the Rams look to repeat again this year. And last year they go out and get Matt Stafford. First year in LA, wins the Super Bowl. He finished quarterback 6 with 4,886 yards, which was 3rd best, 41 touchdowns, which was 2nd best, and 17 interceptions, which was tied for 1st overall for the most interceptions by a quarterback. This was the 2nd best fantasy season of his career. Now, I do see his touchdown numbers coming down somewhere around maybe 35, 34, maybe 2 less interceptions. And with no rushing ability, this would put him around quarterback 12, which I think I have him somewhere around there in the rankings. And right now, that's where he's going, quarterback 12, which is where I think he should go. We saw his ceiling last year, most likely of what he could get to. Obviously, he could probably get right back there. Probably not much better than last year. But for me, he's a guy that would be a solid backup, just not a guy that I'm drafting as my starting quarterback. Running back is Cam Akers, and he's coming in off an injury, missing all of last year. Saw a glimpse of what he could do in 2020, where he had 625 yards and 2 touchdowns. The Rams also have Darrell Henderson, who had 688 yards and 8 total touchdowns last year. With that being said, if Akers stays healthy, I think we can expect him to get around 8 to 900 yards and maybe have 8 total touchdowns, putting him around running back 20. But currently he's going as a running back 14, which right now I'd say he's on my bust list. I haven't made my sleepers and busts, but I kind of know who's going to be on there. And Cam Akers will definitely be on there as a bust. I think Darrell Henderson still plays a role, which will affect Cam Akers' ability to really take off. And we assume that he will stay healthy, which is very unlikely with Cam Akers. So I think that's way, way too high at running back 14 for Cam Akers. At best, I see him as running back 20. Now, the wide receivers, Cooper Kupp, Allen Robinson, and Van Jefferson. Now, we all know Cooper Kupp. He just shocked the world. He had one of the best fantasy performances in fantasy football history. He finished number 1 overall with 439 fantasy points, almost 100 ahead of Devontae Adams as the wide receiver 2. He had 145 receptions, almost 2,000 receiving yards, and 16 touchdowns. Now we'll get back to him in a minute, but the Rams added wide receiver Allen Robinson from the Bears, who only had 1 touchdown last season, but he has been a top fantasy wide receiver in the past. And now you throw him into this great passing game in LA, and he can maybe get back to being one of those top wide receivers. They also have Van Jefferson. He was wide receiver 36 last year, 50 receptions, 802 yards, and 6 touchdowns. So let's take a look at the current ADP list, which is Kupp, wide receiver 1, Robinson, wide receiver 32, and Van Jefferson, wide receiver 66. Now, if you take away 25 receptions, 400 yards, and 4 touchdowns from Kupp from last year, so you're looking at about 120 receptions, about 1,500 yards, and right around 12 touchdowns. He still would have been wide receiver 1, which is why I still like him as wide receiver 1, because we assume that he won't be as, well, I shouldn't say as talented, but he won't put up the numbers that he did last year. That's probably his ceiling, but the floor is high as well for him. So easily my wide receiver 1. And I found that even in the 6th round, or not 6th round, but with the 6th overall pick, you're able to get Cooper Kupp, which is a steal. I did a video on my TikTok, the Beast Benny Cakes, that showed a mock draft from pick 6, and I got him 1st overall, which was insane value. Now, Allen Robinson, he will have, in my opinion, around 75 receptions, 950 yards, and 8 touchdowns, which is right around wide receiver 26. So I think at wide receiver 32, that's good value for him there. Probably not much higher, I would take him, than the wide receiver 26, somewhere around there, but he definitely has some upside. Now, tight end, we have Tyler Hickby, who had one of his better seasons last year, 61 receptions, 560 yards, and 5 touchdowns, which was good for tight end 13. I'd expect similar numbers this season. Right now, he's at tight end 18, which I would draft him a little bit closer to the top 10. So a sleeper for me to be able to finish in the top 10 this year. But definitely a guy that could be a solid backup for you later in the draft. Now their defense is great. It's one of the best. Some pros is that they just have a great overall team all around. But the problem is they have a lot of pressure of repeating this season and performing, just as good as they did. So can they do that this year? I don't know. But last year I projected that they'd go 11-6, and of course they go 12-5. So only one off, which isn't bad. This year I like them at 12-5 as well to finish with the same record. The San Francisco 49ers finished third in the division with a 10-7 record last season. This was their second best record since 2013. This year, though, they turned the tides to Trey Lance. Now, Lance has taken over for Jimmy Garoppolo, in which Jimmy Garoppolo finished quarterback 17 last year with 20 touchdowns, 12 interceptions. Trey Lance played in a few games last year. He had 5 touchdowns, 7 interceptions. He also had over 100 rushing yards and a touchdown. So we haven't seen him that much. That's who they're going with. They're going away from Jimmy G, who almost took him to a Super Bowl. Doesn't make sense to me, but they, went out and got Trey Lance last year early on in the draft. So what's my predictions for him? Well, I see him right around 15 touchdowns, 14 interceptions, 3,000 passing yards, and probably around 500 rushing yards and 6 rushing touchdowns, which would be about fantasy quarterback 18. Right now, his ADP is quarterback 13. Another bust, in my opinion, will be Trey Lance. I know a lot of people are saying that he's a sleeper, but I see him as a bust, and I think he finishes closer to quarterback 20. Elijah Mitchell, as a rookie last year, played in 11 games as he dealt with injuries most of the season, but in those games, he still added 963 yards and 5 touchdowns. Mitchell is better in non-PPR than PPR due to his low pass catching ability, but he still finished running back 25 with missing 6 games. He was on pace to finish running back 8. For this year, if he's healthy, I think he'll have about 1,100 rushing yards and 8 touchdowns, putting him around running back 12. Now, I know there's some more injury concerns with Mitchell. I think there's a hamstring issue, which is really concerning to me. If he wouldn't have had that hamstring issue, I probably would have taken him around RB 15 or 16. Right now, he's going running back 23. So if he doesn't have an issue with the hamstring, I think he's a sleeper of mine to finish close to the top 10. But you have to play it safe with Mitchell, who is very, very injury prone. Now, the wide receivers, Deebo Samuel and Brandon Ayuk, are the two that stand out. Deebo Samuel finished wide receiver 3 last year, mainly due to his rushing with Mitchell injured. Receiving wise, he had 77 receptions, 1,400 yards, and 6 touchdowns. On the ground, 365 yards and 8 touchdowns. Ayuk started slow, but finished wide receiver 35 with 56 receptions, 826 yards, and 5 touchdowns. Now, Samuel doesn't want to be a runner, and that should affect him big time in fantasy this year. In the 3 games, though, with Trey Lance, he had 3 of Lance's 5 touchdowns, which is very promising. We see that they have a connection there. But the big takeaway from the rushing and with my predictions is that he still would have been wide receiver 6 without that rushing, with those rushing numbers. His current ADP is wide receiver 5. Now, I think Deebo is risky, at least for this year. I think last year was his ceiling. His floor could go really low with a new quarterback, Trey Lance. And, Samuel performed worse with Ayuk. Or, I'm sorry, I should say Trey Lance performed worse with Brandon Ayuk. His ADP is wide receiver 47, which I think is fair. Again, last year finishing wide receiver 35. Figure he's going to be worse, so that's good value fight for Ayuk there. Tight end George Kittle, he played in 14 games last year. Still finished tight end 4 with 71 receptions, 910 yards, and 6 touchdowns. With Lance, Kittle did fairly worse, but still he is a guy who will probably have 65 receptions, 800 yards, and 6 touchdowns. Still putting him around tight end 4. His current ADP is tight end 5, which is good value and worth the risk for Lance. I think that's right around where I would take him as well. Their defense is average, once being very good. Now the pro is that the same teams coming back pretty much. No real new additions besides Lance taking over at quarterback. But that's also the con. Lance as a starter will take time to develop. So I don't see this team like going nuts right away. I think throughout the season they'll get better, but I don't expect them to just come out of the gate hot with Lance. Now last year they went 10-7. I projected 7-10, thinking they do a lot worse. Um, and this season I think they go 9-8. So one game worse, still above 500 with Trey Lance. But I don't think they'll be going back pretty deep into the playoffs as they did last year. Now, a team that's going to just be pretty bad this year is the Seattle Seahawks. And I was lucky enough to go to the Steelers Seahawks preseason game, got to meet Tyler Lockett, which was awesome, got his autograph. But anyways, the Seahawks, they finished below 500 and had their worst season since 2009. And this was the worst season with Wilson as quarterback. They went 7-10. This year, they made the big trade of sending Russell Wilson to Denver, and in return, they got Noah Fant and Drew Lock. So I don't have much hope for them this year. Their starting quarterback looks like it's going to be Geno Smith. Smith so far has been named the starter. And when he took over for Wilson last year, he had 702 yards, 5 touchdowns, and 1 interception. Lock had around the same numbers in Denver if we compare. Current ADP is Lock, quarterback 32, Smith, quarterback 37. Obviously, Geno could be a sleeper at the quarterback 37. But neither of these guys will be drafted unless you're a Seahawks fan. I'd watch on the waivers, but I think these two are kind of going to be sharing time back and forth. It could be the Drew Lock show eventually in the season if Geno Smith, has a rough start. For running backs, we have Rashad Penny and Kenneth Walker III. Penny will be the starting running back. However, Penny has only played in 23 games out of a possible 49 in the last 3 years. In his 10 games, though, last year, he did have 6 touchdowns. Kenneth Walker was drafted in the second round out of Michigan State. He had 1,600 yards, 18 touchdowns last year for them on the ground. I think Walker, at some point during the season, especially since Penny is injury prone, I think Walker will take over as the RB1 for the team. The current ADP is Rashad Penny, running back 36, and for Kenneth Walker, running back 37. So they're going back to back. Again, I'd rather take Walker because of his upside right there, knowing that Penny will most likely miss time due to injuries. Now the wide receivers are Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf. Last year, Metcalf and Lockett both had great seasons. Metcalf finished wide receiver 14 with 75 receptions, 967 yards, and 12 touchdowns. Lockett finished wide receiver 16 with 2 less receptions, 1,175 yards, which was about 208 more yards, and he had 4 less touchdowns with 8. With Smith last year, Metcalf had 19 receptions for 295 yards and 5 touchdowns, whereas Lockett had 21 receptions, 2 more, but only 246 touchdowns and 0 touchdowns. Or I should say 246 yards and 0 touchdowns with Geno Smith last year. Currently, their ADP is Metcalf, wide receiver 22, and Lockett, wide receiver 29. I like other guys around them, so I'm kind of staying away as much as I hate to say it. I'm big fans of both, but I would lean more Metcalf if I had to take one, but I'm nervous to take either this season. Tight end is Noah Fant. Fant finished tight end 11 last year with 68 receptions, 670 yards, and 4 touchdowns. I think these numbers drop around 50 receptions, 500 yards, and 4 touchdowns, putting him at tight end 18, which right now he's going as a tight end 14, which I think is all right, but a little too high in my opinion. Oops, I got to go back. Let's go back. Sorry about that. Anyways, the defense, they are just bad. They That's what really hurts them. The cons are that they have bad quarterback play and bad defense. Really, the only pro I can find is that they have two great wide receivers. So last year, boy, was I really high on them. I had them going 12-5. They of course went 7-10, which is completely off. This year, I think they go 4-13. They continue to do worse and finish as one of the worst teams in the NFL. So that is the NFC West for you. Pretty cut and dry. You have the top wide receiver in Cooper Kupp here in the NFC West. He should go right back to that. A couple busts I have coming out of the NFC West in Trey Lance and Cam Akers. And it'll be interesting to see what happens in Arizona with those wide receivers. So some interesting picks here in the NFC West, but that wraps up this 8-week divisional fantasy football breakdown and predictions. If you guys enjoyed, make sure to subscribe. Follow me on Instagram at Sports Luck Podcast, as well as on Spotify. You can listen Sports Luck Podcast. If you're listening on there, I do put PowerPoints up in my YouTube videos so you can see the screen, see projections, see numbers. And next week will be the rankings, sleepers, and bust podcast, which you don't want to miss. I think that's very beneficial to look at before you draft. Remember, I do the homework for you, so all you have to do is listen, take notes, and I'll help make sure that you win your league this season. Thanks for listening in. Hopefully you guys enjoy your weekend, and we'll see you next Tuesday with that Rankings, Busts, and Sleepers podcast. Have a good one.